What do you get when filmmakers decide rules are made to be broken? You get movies so outrageous, so bizarre, that theaters only dared show them after dark. Midnight movies weren't just films, they were secret gatherings where people laughed, gasped, and whispered, "Are we even allowed to watch this?" Some shocked censors, others rewrote the rule book, and a few burned the book entirely. Let's dive into the cult legends that rewired cinema forever. El Topo, 1970. Imagine a Western where cowboys wander deserts of blood and surreal visions, shooting each other while prophets, mystics, and outlaws float in and out of the story. That's El Topo, Alejandro Jodorowsky's infamous fever dream that practically invented the idea of the midnight movie. Audiences didn't know what to expect, but what they got was a barrage of violent duels, symbolic images, and enough weirdness to keep people debating for years. The censors weren't fans. They didn't know how to classify it, and honestly, they weren't wrong. It wasn't a traditional Western, wasn't exactly art house, and wasn't grindhouse either. But that confusion was exactly what made El Topo irresistible. Rumors spread like wildfire. People whispered about hidden meanings. Others claimed it was the most shocking thing they'd ever seen, and the film gained a reputation as dangerous. The movie exploded in popularity in underground theaters, especially in New York. John Lennon himself reportedly helped fund Jodorowsky's next project after falling under its spell. That's how deep this movie burrowed into counterculture. El Topo was chaos in cinematic form, unpolished, unpredictable, and utterly unrepeatable. It was less of a film and more of an experience, the kind that leaves you walking out of the theater at 2 a.m., not sure if you loved it or if you just witnessed a crime. But one thing's for sure, it made midnight movies a phenomenon. Pink Flamingos, 1972. If El Topo invented midnight movies, John Waters' Pink Flamingos cemented their reputation as cultural hand grenades. This was the movie that sent censors scrambling, parents into panic, and audiences into fits of horrified laughter. Billed as an exercise in bad taste, Waters' cult classic wasn't just a movie, it was a dare. Shot on a shoestring in Baltimore with a cast of outrageous characters, the film reveled in being offensive. Waters himself admitted he wanted to make the filthiest movie ever made, and critics agreed he succeeded. Censors tried to stop it, theaters refused to play it, and protest groups demanded it be banned, which of course only made everyone more curious. The midnight crowds showed up in droves. People didn't just watch Pink Flamingos, they reacted to it. Gasps, cheers, nervous laughter. Every showing turned into a circus. It wasn't polished, it wasn't refined, but it was unforgettable. Waters proved that shock value could be an art form, and in doing so, he created a cult hit that still rattles people today. Pink Flamingos broke every possible rule, yet it thrived in the very place rules had no power: the midnight slot. It was less about the film itself and more about the shared rebellion of seeing something forbidden. Love it or hate it, one thing is undeniable: it made midnight movies dangerous again. Eraserhead, 1977. If there was ever a film that felt like a nightmare projected on screen, it's David Lynch's Eraserhead, a film school project that spiraled into a 5-year odyssey. It became one of the strangest cult movies ever made. Midnight audiences latched onto it because no mainstream theater would dare screen it in the daytime. The movie tells the story of Henry Spencer, a man trapped in a decaying industrial landscape, caring for a disturbing infant that looks nothing like a child. Lynch packed the film with grotesque imagery, grinding mechanical soundscapes, and surreal sequences that defy logic. The censors didn't even know what to cut. They just knew it was unlike anything else. Eraserhead became a midnight sensation in Los Angeles, playing for years at the same theater. People obsessed over its meaning, trading theories in hushed tones like they'd stumbled on a secret code. Some called it horror, others called it comedy, but most agreed it was deeply unsettling. And that was its genius. Eraserhead didn't just push boundaries, it erased them entirely. Lynch created a world where nothing made sense, yet everything felt disturbingly real. Midnight audiences left shaken, not sure what they'd just seen, but sure they'd never forget it. That confusion and awe is exactly why it became one of the most legendary midnight movies of all time. The Rocky Horror Picture Show, 1975. Some movies break the rules, but Rocky Horror shredded them and threw the pieces in the air like confetti. What started as a campy musical parody became the most famous midnight movie in history, and still is. At first, critics didn't know what to make of it. Was it a satire, a comedy, a musical that went completely off the rails? The studio wasn't sure how to sell it, so it languished in limited release. But then, midnight audiences claimed it as their own. Fans showed up in costume, shouted lines back at the screen, and eventually turned every screening into an interactive event. That participation horrified traditional theater owners but thrilled everyone else. It was messy, chaotic, and unlike anything moviegoing had ever seen. Rocky Horror's playful embrace of camp, costumes, and defiant self-expression made it more than a film. It became a lifestyle. Censors hated its boldness. Conservative groups wanted it buried. But the harder people tried to shut it down, the stronger it grew. Decades later, it still plays in midnight slots worldwide. Rocky Horror didn't just break censorship rules. It built an entire counterculture around ignoring them. If El Topo started the trend, Rocky Horror made it immortal. Flesh for Frankenstein, 1973. Now imagine walking into a theater, putting on 3D glasses, and watching one of the most outrageous reinterpretations of Frankenstein ever put to film. That's Flesh for Frankenstein, sometimes billed as Andy Warhol's Frankenstein. Though Warhol's actual involvement was debatable. Directed by Paul Morrissey, the film didn't just nudge censors, it stomped on their last nerve. Critics were appalled, audiences were scandalized, and theaters struggled to even promote it. But at midnight, it found its home. The wild performances, grotesque visuals, and deliberately shocking moments made it irresistible to audiences who craved something the mainstream wouldn't deliver. It was one of those films where word of mouth did all the marketing. People whispered about what they'd seen, daring others to experience it. It wasn't just horror, it was absurd, funny in its excess, and defiantly over the top. That mix made it both infamous and unforgettable. Flesh for Frankenstein proved that midnight movies weren't just about breaking rules, they were about creating new ones. Rules where too much wasn't enough, and the only guideline was to make audiences react. Whether they groaned, laughed, or clapped, reaction was the goal. And this movie delivered it in spades. Blood Feast, 1963. Before the slasher craze of the 70s and 80s, there was Herschel Gordon Lewis, a director who basically invented the gore movie. His low-budget shocker Blood Feast is often called the first gore film. And trust me, it didn't just bend the rules, it shredded them. Released in 1963, when most horror was still about spooky castles and rubber bats, Blood Feast came crashing in with hacked-off limbs, gallons of fake blood, and scenes so graphic they left censors horrified. The plot? A crazed caterer kills people to use their body parts in a sacrificial feast. Subtle? Not at all. Effective? Absolutely. Audiences had never seen anything like it. Some fainted, others ran screaming from theaters, and word spread quickly that this wasn't just a scary movie, it was an endurance test. The censors tried to shut it down, but Lewis was smart. He marketed it with posters bragging that it was nothing so appalling in the annals of horror. That line alone filled midnight screenings with curious fans ready to see what the fuss was about. Blood Feast wasn't just shocking for its time, it carved out an entirely new genre. Suddenly, gore was a selling point, not a liability. Today, it might look campy and cheap, but back then, it was pure rebellion. Midnight movies thrive on taboo, and Blood Feast was built on it. Night of the Living Dead, 1968. George Romero's Night of the Living Dead didn't just create the modern zombie, it kicked censorship in the teeth. Released in 1968 without a proper rating, kids and teens walked right into theaters expecting another spooky monster flick, and instead got one of the bleakest, most violent horror films ever made. The film opens with the now iconic graveyard attack, but what really rattled audiences was the unrelenting tension. Corpses rose from their graves, people were torn apart on screen, and the survivors were no better off than the monsters chasing them. The violence was gritty, the atmosphere was grim, and the ending pulled no punches. Censors couldn't stop it because it slipped past rating boards entirely. But what made it even more groundbreaking was its lead. Romero cast Dwayne Jones, a black actor, as the protagonist at a time when that was almost unheard of in horror. His performance added weight and commentary that most audiences didn't even expect. By the time the shocking finale hit, viewers were left stunned, and critics were furious that children had seen it unfiltered. Night of the Living Dead didn't just break the rules, it made new ones. It turned midnight screenings into communal events where audiences bonded over being traumatized together. And from that night forward, zombies were never the same again. Freaks, 1932. Long before the midnight movie boom, Todd Browning's Freaks horrified censors in 1932. The studio promoted it as a shocking horror film, but what really unnerved people was its cast. Real sideshow performers with real conditions, not Hollywood trick makeup. The story follows circus workers, many of them labeled freaks, by outsiders, as they take revenge on those who abuse them. But what upset audiences wasn't the violence. It was seeing people society usually hid away shown up front on screen. The backlash was immediate. MGM pulled the film from theaters, banned it in several states, and chopped out major sections. For decades, Freaks was buried. But in the 1960s, art houses and midnight theaters rediscovered it, and suddenly, it became legendary. What once terrified audiences now drew fascination. The ending, when the performers band together in a rain-soaked crawl toward revenge, was unlike anything people had ever seen. By the time it became a staple of midnight screenings, Freaks had gone from banned oddity to cult classic. It didn't just push censors, it exposed their fear of difference. Midnight audiences embraced it as proof that the most shocking films aren't always about monsters. They're about showing us truths we're too scared to face. Glenn or Glenda 1953. Ed Wood's Glenn or Glenda is often remembered as so bad it's good, but when you place it in context, it's downright radical. Released in 1953, it was marketed as an exploitation film about so-called taboo lifestyles. But Ed Wood, who secretly identified with the subject, made it oddly personal. The film jumps between documentary-style lectures, dreamlike montages, and Wood himself playing the title role. Critics at the time thought it was incoherent and exploitative, and censors considered it scandalous. The movie was pulled from theaters quickly, but like many cult treasures, it found new life years later in midnight circuits. By the 1970s, audiences embraced its strange sincerity and awkward delivery. Midnight viewers laughed at the wooden acting and bizarre imagery, but they also recognized the courage behind it. Wood wasn't just cashing in, he was trying, in his own clumsy way, to express something real in an era that wanted it silenced. That duality, unintentional comedy mixed with raw honesty, is what made Glenn or Glenda thrive as a midnight staple. It broke rules not just with content, but by being completely unclassifiable. Was it camp? Was it confessional? Was it a mess? The answer was yes to all of the above, and that's why it's still unforgettable. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. If you want to talk about a movie that terrified censors, look no further than The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Tobe Hooper's low-budget masterpiece was marketed as being based on true events, and audiences believed it. The result? Pure panic. The film followed a group of young travelers who stumble into the home of a deranged family led by the now legendary Leatherface. What set it apart wasn't buckets of blood. There actually isn't much gore on screen, but its relentless, suffocating dread. Every scene felt dirty, raw, and too real. Critics called it sadistic, and several countries banned it outright. Censors tried to clamp down, but that only fueled the fire. Midnight audiences couldn't get enough, and word spread fast that this was one of the scariest movies ever made. People screamed, fainted, and in some cases bolted from theaters. The shaky handheld camera, buzzing chainsaw, and screaming final girl burned into cultural memory. Texas Chainsaw didn't just break censorship rules, it showed how powerful suggestion could be. You didn't need gallons of fake blood, you just needed atmosphere that made people feel like they shouldn't be watching. Midnight movies live on the edge of danger, and this one practically defined it. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, 1970. When 20th Century Fox released Beyond the Valley of the Dolls, they thought they were putting out a glamorous sequel to their glossy 1967 melodrama. Instead, they got one of the strangest, wildest films in studio history. Directed by cult master Russ Meyer, it was a kaleidoscope of outrageous performances, psychedelic colors, and a plot that veered from soap opera to sheer madness. The movie followed an all-girl rock band caught up in Hollywood's world of fame, betrayal, and bizarre excess. But this wasn't some sanitized studio picture. Meyer cranked up the chaos to 11. The editing was jagged, the tone shifted without warning, and every frame dared censors to object. They did. Critics howled that it was tasteless, the MPAA slapped it with an X rating, and Fox executives panicked. But midnight audiences? They loved it. Word spread that this wasn't the polite drama Fox advertised, it was a full-blown cult spectacle. The randomness, the surreal dialogue, and the explosive finale turned it into legend. It was camp. It was chaos. And it was completely unforgettable. Beyond the Valley of the Dolls didn't just break rules, it exposed the cracks in Hollywood itself. Studio Polish met underground rebellion, and the result was a glorious mess too wild for prime time. Perfect for midnight, where movies could finally be as weird as they wanted. I Drink Your Blood, 1970. Few films scream midnight madness louder than I Drink Your Blood. This was exploitation cinema at its most chaotic, and it didn't just push boundaries, it gleefully trampled them. Released in 1970, it mixed everything censors dreaded: cults, rabies, hallucinogens, and unrelenting violence. No one had ever seen a film like it, and even drive-in theaters didn't quite know what they were getting into. The story centered on a group of devil-worshipping drifters who terrorize a small town. But when a local boy decides to fight back, he injects rabies-infected dog blood into pies and feeds it to the cult. From there, the film turns into pure chaos. Wild-eyed characters foaming at the mouth, attacking strangers, and spiraling into madness. It wasn't polished, but it was unforgettable. Censors hacked away at the film, and different states released wildly different cuts. Some versions ran barely over an hour, others played nearly uncut. But rather than shy away from the controversy, the filmmakers leaned into it. Posters bragged about it being the most blood-soaked film ever made, and audiences lined up to see if they could handle it. Midnight crowds adored its excess. It wasn't scary in the traditional sense, it was raw, grotesque, and weirdly fun. The movie proved that excess itself could be entertainment, making I Drink Your Blood a cult staple that still feels dangerous even now. Cannibal Holocaust 1980. When people talk about midnight movies going too far, Cannibal Holocaust is usually the first name dropped. Released in 1980, this Italian import became one of the most controversial films ever projected in U.S. theaters. By the time it reached American midnight slots, its reputation was already infamous, and horror fans dared each other to survive a screening. Shot as a faux documentary, the film followed a team of filmmakers who vanish while making a movie in the Amazon. Months later, their recovered footage reveals their shocking fate. Presented with gritty realism, it blurred the line between fiction and reality, and audiences left wondering how much of it had been real. That illusion made it both compelling and horrifying. Censors didn't know where to start. It was banned in multiple countries, and in the US, many theaters simply refused to show it. Yet the forbidden aura only fueled its legend. Midnight screenings became endurance tests. Some viewers left pale and shaken, while others claimed it was a masterpiece of shock cinema. Cannibal Holocaust didn't just break censorship rules, it forced audiences to rethink what cinema could even get away with. Love it or hate it, its impact was undeniable. Midnight movies thrive on extremes, and this one delivered the ultimate dare. Faster, Pussycat. Kill, Kill, 1965. Russ Meyer had already built a reputation for outrageous low-budget films, but Faster, Pussycat, Kill, Kill was something different. Released in 1965, it put three aggressive, violent women front and center, something almost unheard of in Hollywood at the time. Instead of damsels in distress, these women were predators, and that reversal rattled both censors and critics. The film followed a trio of go-go dancers who stormed through the desert in muscle cars, leaving mayhem in their wake. They kidnap, fight, and kill, all while delivering dialogue that veered between camp and menace. The characters were larger than life, and Meyer filmed them with the same energy he usually reserved for over-the-top action. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Too violent for mainstream audiences and too strange for art house circles, the film stumbled at release. But in midnight theaters, it found a second life. Fans were drawn to its raw attitude, its fast cars, and its unapologetic energy. Over time, Faster, Pussycat became a cult classic. Directors like Quentin Tarantino and Robert Rodriguez openly cited it as inspiration. Its legacy wasn't just in its style, but in its audacity. Meyer flipped conventions, and the midnight crowd embraced it as proof that rule-breaking could be thrilling, stylish, and unforgettable. Reefer Madness, 1936. Reefer Madness might be the oldest film on this list, but its midnight movie legacy is unmatched. Originally released in 1936 as a propaganda tool, it was meant to terrify parents with exaggerated tales of marijuana use. Instead, it ended up becoming one of the funniest, most unintentionally entertaining films ever rediscovered. The story warned that a single puff of smoke would lead young people into chaos, crime, melodramatic breakdowns, and absurd tragedy. The performances were stiff, the dialogue was laughable, and the warnings were so overblown that modern audiences couldn't take them seriously. By the time it resurfaced in the 1970s, it was instantly embraced as comedy. Midnight crowds turned screenings into interactive events. Audiences shouted back at the screen, mocked the characters, and treated it like a live comedy show. What was once a cautionary tale became a communal joke, and the film's serious tone only made it funnier. Reefer Madness is proof that censorship can backfire spectacularly. A film designed to scare an audience ended up fueling rebellion decades later. At midnight, irony reigned supreme, and Reefer Madness became the ultimate cult punchline, a reminder that the harder authority tries to control culture, the faster it can turn into a comedy classic. Scorpio Rising, 1964. Kenneth Anger's Scorpio Rising wasn't just a movie, it was a Molotov cocktail aimed at censorship itself. Running just under an hour, this underground short followed a biker gang through a collage of imagery, pop songs, and visuals that left traditional audiences stunned. Censors had no idea how to classify it. Was it documentary? Was it narrative? Was it art? All they knew was that it broke every rule they had. What made Scorpio Rising so radical was its use of popular music. Long before MTV or music videos, Anger edited entire sequences to jukebox hits, setting violent and rebellious images against songs by Elvis, Ray Charles, and the Angels. The result was hypnotic, dangerous, and strangely beautiful. It was a world where chrome motorcycles gleamed, leather jackets shimmered, and rebellion pulsed through every frame. The censors were furious. The film was seized by police during its early runs and obscenity charges flew. But in midnight theaters, Scorpio Rising thrived. Audiences were mesmerized by its daring style, its unapologetic attitude, and its refusal to follow cinematic norms. Anger didn't just bend censorship, he laughed at it. Scorpio Rising was proof that midnight movies didn't need big budgets or stars. They just needed nerve. And Anger had more than enough to turn this short into a defining piece of underground cinema. Plan 9 from Outer Space, 1957. When Ed Wood made Plan 9 from Outer Space, he wasn't trying to shock anyone. He was just trying to make a sci-fi horror movie on a budget of pocket change. The result was so awkward, so poorly stitched together, that censors didn't even bother. But when midnight audiences rediscovered it years later, they turned it into legend. The film tells of aliens resurrecting the dead to stop humanity from creating a doomsday weapon. That alone could have been pulpy fun. But Ed Wood's lack of resources turned it into something else entirely. Tombstones topple when touched, spaceships wobble like toys, and dialogue clunks along like it was written in a single draft. Even the great Bela Lugosi, who died before filming, is awkwardly replaced mid-film by a stand-in holding a cape over his face. What made Plan 9 thrive at midnight was its sincerity. Wood poured his heart into it, even if his craft couldn't match his ambition. Audiences laughed, cheered, and quoted its lines as if they were watching high art. It wasn't about perfection, it was about passion. By the 1970s, critics crowned it the worst movie ever made. But midnight audiences knew better. They turned Plan 9 into a celebration of failure so spectacular that it became success. In breaking every rule of how to make a movie, Ed Wood accidentally created the perfect midnight experience. Midnight movies weren't just films. They were battles fought against censors, critics, and the idea that movies had to play it safe. From surreal westerns to cheap sci-fi disasters, these films thrived precisely because they broke every rule. Some shocked, some confused, and some made people laugh until they cried. Which of these culty classics have you braved at midnight? Drop your favorite in the comments, hit that subscribe, and remember, cinema is always wildest when the rules are ignored.